Douglas coming from Philadelphia, who I feel like is pretty solid about getting ahead on in-house extensions or projecting forward what they have during his tenure, was two names come to mind for me in-house, and I know there's more, but one, they never got ahead on a Bryce Huff extension, and not that Bryce Huff had a great year in Philadelphia, but the reaction to that was trading for Hassan Reddick, which was one of the worst moves of the entire Joe Douglas tenure and one of the worst moves in recent Jets history. But then quietly, after 2021, they let Morgan Moses walk. He plays really, really strong football for Baltimore for 2 years, and they trade for him to bring him back. But when he was gone, tackle was an absolute disaster for the Jets, and that was a big talking point as well. And they had a lot of bad reactionary moves to try to fix tackle. Jason, I know it's a hard one because part of it is definitely blamed on the general manager for not getting ahead on those extensions. But is there also an owner element in those situations because of the cash required that the fan can't really see or have the information on?
Yeah, I think that's a big deal. You're talking about the Eagles. The Eagles basically have an endless budget. There is a willingness to spend there that I don't think exists in New York. And I'm not saying that Woody Johnson is cheap. There's times where he gets cheap, and then there's times where he just says, "Go and spend on whatever."
It's very uneven.
But
yeah,
yeah, he is, and that makes it hard too for a general manager. Sometimes you have no idea. Joe Douglas very easily could have been going into this season saying, "Okay, I'm going to have the fifth highest budget in the NFL, like I had in 2023," only to find out, no, like no chance of that happening. But yeah, that helps you get in front of those extensions when if you go to the owner's just going to say, "Yeah, sure, go ahead and do it." Whereas here, you might go and he might say, "No, he doesn't think this is the time to do it. Let him prove a little more," or I need to see that higher Madden rating, or whatever the stuff is when they have their discussions there. But I think that's been something that's gone on there. The Eagles are not afraid to make guys the highest paid players at their position. You look at the Jets with Quinn and Williams, and obviously they came to an agreement on that. But they fought and fought and fought on that thing just to make sure he would come in, just under like a certain number.
Yeah, they
and
waited
it's
it
like,
out.
yeah, the Eagles wouldn't do that. And if you go back to the Moses signing originally, that was one where waiting it out was successful. They got him for dirt cheap. But then you looked at other times they tried to do that thing when they who was it that they signed, the old tackle from, was it Seattle?
Dwayne Brown.
Dwayne Brown. And, they waited. Guy gets hurt. Their own guy gets hurt. And now it's like, all right, we're going to give this guy who's at the end of his career, 2-year contract. Now it's like you were just fighting to get this guy for $3 million, and now you're signing him for $10 million or whatever it was.
It's a lot of money.
And if you watch the Jets patterns, even guys that they were linked to that would get released, like Odell Beckham or something like that, it was the same MO every time. It's like, we're going to wait this out. We're going to wait this out. We're going to wait this out. And it's like, either the guy is going to fall to you, or more often than not, you're either going to lose him, or if you want to grab him, you're going to end up overpaying for him. And that seemed to be something that happened a lot to the Jets over the course of Douglas's tenure that was there.
Is there something to, I'm going to use the phrase, building it the right way? Every time the Jets hire a new GM, it's, this guy is going to build it the right way. He comes from the Eagles. He comes from the Ravens. He comes from Seattle. He comes from Parcells. He learned from Parcells. He knows how to build it the right way, which usually is loosely defined as being patient, building through the draft and not free agency. I find that there probably isn't a perfect definition for this. And many times the Jets would lose out on someone. They would be outbid by a team like the Ravens or the Eagles, who are winning every year, even if they make mistakes, or the Ravens lose 2 of their starting linemen to the Jets. They're still where they are this year. Same with the Eagles. They signed Bryce Huff. It's a disaster. It doesn't matter. They're still really good. Is there a such thing as building it the right way in the NFL? And like, does that even make sense? And if you were like a new GM taking over the Jets situation, what is sort of like a loose sort of guideline that you're using to put something sustainable in place for competency? Like what are the boxes that need to be checked, or is it just too varied organization to organization?
Yeah, I think it's varied. I mean, if you're in a perfect world, yeah, there's absolutely a perfect way to, a right way to build a football team. You're building through the draft. You're focusing on if you don't have a quarterback, you're focusing on, offensive line, defensive line until you can bring that quarterback in. You're getting those extensions done early on the players that you think can contribute 7, 8 years. You're filling in your little voids with free agents. You're letting certain guys walk when it's time to do that. You're making the trades. I mean, all that stuff is all well and good, but when you come into some of these situations like the Jets, and like many of these bad teams, when you get a new general manager, you look at what's there in front of you. There's really nothing there. You look at the Jets. It's some old football players, and then you've got a couple of star players like Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson, who, just from a realistic standpoint, I know people hate to hear this, by the time your organization is any good, those guys aren't going to be good anymore. The odds are strongly against a cornerback being good for 8 years. Wide receivers basically start trending down after 5 or 6 years. So, it's great to say, there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. But I think every situation is very different. And, you look at the Jets right now, they're going to go into this with a draft pick that isn't necessarily going to net them a quarterback. And so without that there, it's like, well, what's your next path? So, if it was me, I would say offensive line. Are there any offensive linemen in this draft? Who knows with that stuff? And the draft is a big crapshoot. So, I mean, ideally, yeah, you want to get as many homegrown players as you can. But there's really no set blueprint. You look at a team like the Buffalo Bills. They've always been like just a group of free agents. I mean, that's basically what it is. They've been pretty good with that, and they hit on the quarterback. And they got some key pieces on that offensive line, and their coaching staff is able to kind of change what they do at times, offensively and defensively to get the most out of those players. But I don't think there's an exact science to being able to build a team. A lot of it is luck. And, a lot of it is just the timing of it. And by the time you take over a job, I mean, rosters are in shambles. So you're essentially building like an expansion team. That's not easy to do.
So that brings me to the look ahead, Jason, which is this is kind of a weird year the Jets are going into. And it is, of course, more difficult because there's the lingering Rodgers equation. But we'll start with the easy scenario that he's not back with the Jets and they're going to sit on a hefty cap hit. Or I guess that's the question I pose to you. Is this a transition year where you look at quarterback, you go, okay, we have guaranteed money tied up to Tyrod Taylor. So that's already, locked in. We can go out and do we bring in competition like a Justin Fields? They're not picking in this draft where they're going to get their savior, and it's not a deep quarterback draft, and they're not in range for one of those guys. Is this an actual transition year for the Jets where maybe you sit out free agency, you try to get your comp pick formula right, and you're trying to get past as much of the Rodgers era and Joe Douglas era money you can? Like, is that the most feasible approach to this? As much as that's always difficult for a new regime, them having to, kind of sell that to the fan base for a year.
So I think if the owner is on board with that, that's probably the right way to approach it. You take whatever dead money that you have to take this year, which might be a lot, and you kind of turn the page. You do what you can in the draft to bring a couple of those building block players in. You're doing free agency to where you're just kind of going out and doing the minimum to make sure you're fielding a roster that's at least an NFL quality roster. I'm not saying you go out there and you just completely tank the season, but you're going to go out there and you're just going to sign some guys for 1 or 2 years that are on pretty low price contracts. If you go back to when, going way back when you mentioned Tannenbaum before, when he took over the Jets in 2006, I believe it was, that was really their approach the first 2 years. They had to work themselves through some bad contracts at the time with, Chad Pennington and some older players that were all kind of retiring at that point. And they kind of pieced things together. They got one playoff year out of it where they had that surprising 2006, crash and burn right back to the bottom 2007. But, they didn't go overboard in 2007. They kind of stuck with that plan. And they said 2008 rolls around, we're going to have a lot of cap space, a lot of money we can spend. And, they did. They went out there and they signed a whole bunch of free agents. Fortunately, led to the whole Brett Favre thing. But, they got a good run out of it the next 2 years. And that foundation was actually built starting in 2006 by not going crazy and by getting the books cleared out and just kind of trying to do that building block, building of the team where you're bringing in a left tackle, you're bringing in a center, you're bringing in a couple of those positions that are going to be productive for 7, 8, 9 years, and letting the money kind of fall off from some of the older guys. And if Woody's on board with that, I would think that you do that. You just have to give to the fans, some kind of hope. You can't go out there and just not even compete. I think in the NFL that's just impossible. And I know everybody falls in love with getting the first overall pick. As you can see through the years, that doesn't mean anything with the
team
quarterbacks.
Can't tank.
Yeah.
You'd lose the pulse of all the young guys on the team.
So I think you try to do something where even if you're in that 7th wild card contention with 2 weeks left in the season, even though you're sitting there with, barely on the fringe, you're in the bubble, that on the bubble, whatever you want to call it. I think that would probably be enough. You're showing that you're trying. You hope a couple of the guys that you sign, even though they're cheaper, go out there and give you some effort. And, they're going to have their own contracts they have to navigate here too. I don't know how many are definitely going to be on the team or not on the team. You hope you get some good years out of them, focus on those players. That at least brings some excitement, I think, to the fan base. And I think that'll protect you from, what's going on with the Giants, where the Giants kind of overshot that first year. And then they just really bought into the fact that, like, okay, yeah, we turned it around because we're such awesome coaches.
Right.
And, you turn right back into a pumpkin the next year. And now, I mean, they're just, somehow those guys kept their jobs. But, that's probably the lowest point that I've ever seen the Giants in terms of, where their fans are with that team right now. And I think you want to avoid that if you're the Jets. You want to avoid that Idzik structure where someone just comes in, tears it down, and you get the feeling like they're not even trying to do anything right now. I think that would be a problem. But I think whatever you do has to be eye for the future. You're not looking to get into anything where, 3 years from now, you're like, oh, I can't believe I'm stuck with these 2 or 3 contracts. Like, just do whatever you got to do for 1 year and kind of go from there.
So before we wrap, bigger step back here. Douglas and Salah, when someone asks you, where do these guys rank in like Jets history? Like, at least to your like memory and knowledge, like best GM, worst GM, best head coach, worst head coach. Obviously, we know they're not up by the best, but where do they sort of rank in the hierarchy? You think of the last like 10 or so Jet GMs, Idzik, McCagnon, Tannenbaum, Bradway, Parcells, technically Cote-tight, guys they had in the 80s, Salah, the list they've had at head coach. Like, where do you think they'll be remembered, and where do you rank them overall for the Jets?
So I don't think Douglas is going to get remembered much at all. I think he's probably just going to be looked at as a guy who somehow kept a job for however many years. Wasn't the greatest of situations he came into, but it certainly didn't improve. I think that he'd probably be looked at as worse than McCagnon. I think people look back a little bit more at McCagnon. He had the 1 year with some of the guys that he traded for and that he signed, and a couple of draft picks that were relatively productive. So I think he'll rank pretty low. Not as low as the Cote-tight era, but he'll be pretty low on there. I think Salah will probably be pretty forgettable as a head coach, along the lines of like Bruce Coslett, where you get a couple year run, don't really do anything. You're kind of a fringe playoff contender here and there. That's probably where it'll go. I can't say it'll be like Al Groh. Al Groh was only there for the 1 year, and then the team just kind of quit on him at the end of the season. But I don't think he'll be remembered as fondly as like a Herman Edwards. Certainly not Rex Ryan. Anything like that. It may be similar like Todd Bowles. I think he'll get another job at some point. Maybe he can, salvage his reputation as a coach. But I don't think anyone is going to look back at him fondly and say, he did a lot of things. I think the main stuff people are going to remember is, the Jets had this coach that ran up and down the stairs before the game and would jump up and down on the sidelines every now and then when a guy got a big hit. And I think that's all people are really going to remember from that, because there really weren't any big moments, I think, to remember in terms of success. For any kind of big football game, you just didn't have anything like that.
Jason, we always appreciate your time. One of these days, we will have you on talking about a positive situation. It's going to happen one decade. We're in decade 2 of not happening, but maybe in decade 3, it happens.
We'll see. Yes. We'll see. One of these years, they just by dumb luck, they have to get into the playoffs. Maybe the NFL expand to like 15 teams, make the